Imagine a world where half the people you know are gone in just a few years. Not from war, but from an invisible enemy that arrived on a ship. This isn't a movie plot. This was the reality for England in 1348. The Black Death had arrived, and it would change the course of history forever. It all started in the summer of 1348. A ship, likely from France, docked at the port of Melcombe in Dorset. Unseen and unknown to the sailors, it carried a deadly passenger, the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This microscopic killer was hosted by fleas, which in turn lived on the black rats scurrying in the ship's hold. Once ashore, the rats and their fleas spread, and with them, the plague. From the coast, it moved inland with terrifying speed, following the well-trodden trade routes. It was like a fire catching on dry tinder. Soon, major towns like Bristol, Norwich, and the crowded, bustling heart of the kingdom London were engulfed. People had no idea what was happening. They only knew that a horrifying and swift death was sweeping through their land. What did this invisible enemy do to a person? The first signs were terrifying. Painful, egg-sized swellings, called buboes, would appear in the armpits, neck, or groin. Then came a raging fever, violent chills, and vomiting. Finally, dark, black blotches would spread across the skin, a result of internal bleeding. This is what gave the plague its grim name, the Black Death. For most, death was not a prolonged agony. It was brutally quick, often arriving within just 3 to 5 days. Imagine the sheer terror. One day, your neighbor is healthy, and a few days later, their house is sealed, marked with a cross. In a world without germ theory, people desperately sought explanations. Many saw it as divine punishment, a sign of God's wrath for humanity's sins. Others believed the air itself was poisoned, a foul miasma that carried the disease. This fear bred panic and desperation. Communities turned on themselves. People fled the cities, inadvertently carrying the plague with them into the countryside. Others locked themselves away, hoping to wait out the storm. Tragically, fear also gave rise to persecution. Foreigners, beggars, and other marginalized groups were blamed, becoming scapegoats for a disaster no one could comprehend. Society was fraying at the seams, gripped by a terror that was as contagious as the disease itself. The scale of the devastation is almost impossible to fathom today. Modern historians estimate that in just 2 years, the Black Death wiped out between 30 and 50% of England's population. That's roughly 2 to 3 million people. Let that sink in. Entire villages simply vanished from the map, their homes left to crumble, their fields implode. The harvest rotted where it stood because there was no one left to bring it in. Trade ground to a halt. The normal rhythms of life ceased. Churchyards filled up so quickly that authorities had to dig massive, deep trenches known as plague pits to dispose of the endless bodies. It was a world turned upside down. Even the clergy, who bravely ministered to the sick and dying, suffered immense losses. In some dioceses, nearly half the priests died, leaving communities without spiritual guidance in their darkest hour. But from the ashes of this catastrophe, something new and unexpected began to grow. With so many dead, the most basic law of economics kicked in: supply and demand. Suddenly, labor was incredibly scarce. The peasants and serfs who survived found themselves in a position of unprecedented power. For the first time, they could demand higher wages and better conditions. Why stay bound to one Lord Esland when another a few miles away was desperate for workers and willing to pay more? This new reality struck a fatal blow to the very foundation of medieval society, feudalism. The old system, where a peasant was tied to the land and a lord for life, was crumbling. The survivors were no longer just cogs in a machine. They were individuals with value. The ruling class, of course, did not take this lying down. The lords and the kings saw their power and wealth slipping away. In 1351, King Edward III's government passed the Statute of Laborers, an attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force people to work for their old masters. But you can't legislate against reality. The law was widely ignored and deeply resented. It created a simmering tension between the landowners and the newly empowered workforce. This growing anger and sense of injustice would eventually boil over, contributing directly to major uprisings like the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The Black Death didn't just kill people. It killed an old social order. The psychological and spiritual impact was just as profound. People had prayed, fasted, and flocked to churches, but the plague raged on. It led to a massive crisis of faith. If God was all-powerful and all-good, why would He allow such indiscriminate suffering? The Church, the most powerful institution of the age, seemed helpless. Its rituals and relics had failed to provide protection. This loss of credibility was a serious blow. In the plague's wake, new, more extreme religious movements appeared, like the Flagellants, who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to atone for the world's sins. For many ordinary people, faith became more personal, more direct. A relationship between them and God that didn't necessarily need the church as an intermediary. The Black Death was a horrifying chapter in human history, but its long-term legacy was transformative. For the survivors, life paradoxically got better. With fewer people, there was more food, more land, and more resources to go around. The standard of living for the average English worker rose significantly. Many serfs were able to buy their freedom and become independent farmers or artisans, creating a new and growing middle class. The plague also forced a shift in thinking. When prayers and superstitions failed, some began to look for more practical, observable causes of disease. It was a slow, tentative first step away from medieval mysticism and towards a more scientific approach to medicine. Ultimately, by shattering the rigid structures of feudalism and weakening the absolute authority of the Church, the Black